The wind came down from the mountains like it carried stories no one wanted to tell. It pushed through the bare trees, through the broken wooden fences, through the ragged edges of a forgotten land where winter had overstayed its welcome. Snow didn't fall anymore. It clung, old and hardened, like memories that refused to melt. A narrow dirt road lay swallowed by the white, barely visible, as if nature was trying to erase it. At the end of that road, a cabin leaned into the cold like a tired man who had learned not to expect company. Smoke whispered from its crooked chimney, not steady but enough to say someone was trying. Inside, the widow moved like someone used to silence. Her boots were worn, her hands rough, but her eyes held the kind of patience only hardship can carve. She didn't hum while she worked. She didn't cry when her fingers cracked from cold. She just did what needed to be done, starting the stove, breaking ice for water, feeding 2 small children before the light even touched the floor. Her son had a cough that came and went like an old friend with bad timing. Her daughter had begun asking questions she couldn't answer anymore, about their father, about the cold, about why they always had to be the ones helping others, but rarely helped themselves. That morning, as the fire finally caught and the steam curled above a dented kettle, the girl pressed her forehead against the frost-kissed window and whispered, "Mama, there's something outside." The widow didn't rush. Rushing was for people who had margin for panic. She stepped out onto the porch, coat hanging open, wind slapping her cheeks like reality. There, barely 5 feet from her broken gate, was a man collapsed face first in the snow, a coat too fine for this kind of place, boots worn but expensive, and blood, a bloom of it staining the white near his shoulder like spilled ink on a clean page. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. There was no one to call. She just looked at him, then at the sky, as if asking again, "Why here?" Then she knelt, not because she trusted him, but because somewhere deep inside she remembered what it felt like to be left to die and watch the world move on. 2 days after she dragged the stranger into her home, the widow stood in town with her children pressed, close to her sides, one clutching her coat, the other coughing into the crook of his elbow. Her boots left faint wet marks on the churchhouse floor as she stepped into the back of the gathering, unnoticed at first. The town hall was full, not with warmth, but with voices that pretended to care. Farmers in worn denim, women with pressed coats, shopkeepers and ranch hands, all gathered around the preacher who now wore a different hat, community judge, dispenser of moral warnings. And in the center of it all, slumped in a wheelchair borrowed from the clinic, sat the man she had saved. Cleaned up, bandaged, but still pale and silent, the old millionaire rancher now looked like he belonged to them again. He had been missing for days before the widow found him. Now, in the warm hall of community eyes and folded hands, he was property again, not person. She kept him, one woman whispered loudly, not looking at the widow but wanting her to hear. In her house, with her children, without telling anyone. She probably thought he'd write her into the will, another voice added, softer but sharper. The preacher cleared his throat. We thank God Mr. Callahan survived, but the way of decency must be preserved. There are ways of doing things in this town. Protocols, doors you knock on before taking things into your own hands. Nobody asked what would have happened had she left him there to freeze. Nobody thanked the cracked palms that carried his weight, or the torn blanket she gave up to wrap his body. All eyes turned to her like she had dirtied something sacred, not because she did wrong, but because she reminded them of how little they would have done. She didn't speak. Neither did her children. The boy gripped her hand tighter. The girls. I searched the faces that once gave her sweets during sermons, but now looked through her like fogged glass. Then from the back of the room, a chair scraped. It wasn't loud, but it broke everything. The rancher shifted, slow but deliberate, and raised his hand, not to speak, not to bless, just to point. His finger shook slightly as it lifted toward the widow. Everyone turned to look at her again, but this time their eyes carried confusion, because when he spoke his voice was cracked, not with age, but with something harder to name. She didn't take me in. She brought me back to life. Silence. Real silence, the kind that carries shame like a coat everyone suddenly realizes they're wearing. The snow hadn't melted, but the silence inside the cabin had. Not with words, but with movement. He stayed, not because he was grateful, not because he trusted them, maybe because the road was still frozen, or maybe because he hadn't decided if he still wanted to leave the world that had already left him once. He slept on the small cot near the stove, his breath sometimes hitching in sleep like he was running from something that followed him, even in dreams. The widow didn't ask questions. She simply laid a folded quilt beside him one night, patched from old dresses and shirts long outgrown. He didn't thank her. He only pulled it over his shoulder and faced the wall. On the third day, a knock echoed on the cabin door, not from town, but from the tree line. The girl peeked through the curtain, then whispered, "Mama, it's the man with the mule." He wasn't a friend, just a loner who passed once every few months with furs and salt. He never gave his name, never looked you in the eye, but his mule always carried too much, and he always had just enough to spare. This time, he handed the widow a wrapped bundle without a word. Dried meat, a small jar of honey, a cracked tin of coffee. Then he glanced at the rancher sitting by the fire, half asleep, and said the first full sentence he'd ever spoken in. "That house. He's the one who used to buy the whole valley, ain't he?" The widow didn't answer, but the mule man grunted. Not judgment, just memory. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of rabbit hides and set them beside the boy, coughing on the floor. He ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture so sudden it startled even the mule, then turned without waiting for thanks. That night, the rancher took a piece of the dried meat and quietly placed it in the boy's tin bowl without being asked. The next morning, he was outside before the widow, chopping wood. His swings were slow, clumsy, his shoulder stiff from injury, but the logs split anyway. He didn't speak when she came to the porch. He just nodded toward the stacked pile and wiped his forehead with a hand still bandaged. She poured 2 cups of weak coffee that day, set one beside him. Neither of them touched the mugs while they were still hot. But they sat a little closer to the stove that night. The days slowed after the storm, not because the world outside had changed, but because the world inside the cabin had begun to soften. The wind still howled at night, dragging its fingers across the windows like it wanted in. But the fire held strong now, steady, dependable, like someone had decided it was worth keeping lit. The rancher no longer asked when he would leave. The widow no longer waited for him to. They existed in a rhythm that didn't need speaking, a shared silence that made room for breathing, not explaining. Mornings began early. The widow stirred the coals and sliced bread that barely held its shape. The children layered kindling under the stove. The rancher, shoulder still healing, carried water from the creek in an old bucket with a crack patched by tar. No one asked him to, but when the widow saw the bucket steaming near the fire, she left a folded scarf beside it, clean, hand-stitched, hers. There was no thank you, no exchange of words, just the quiet acceptance of each other's presence. In the afternoons, he mended the door hinge that always leaned too far left. She kneaded dough beside the window, where the sun sometimes landed like a silent guest. The children played with stones, arranged into games they never fully explained. Sometimes the girl would bring her doll, made of cloth and buttons, and whisper stories to it near the fire, her voice low enough to keep them hers. One evening, a storm rolled in, not with fury, but with weight. The sky turned iron grey. The trees bent slightly, and the widow, instead of tightening the latch or closing the curtains, handed the rancher a second blanket and motioned to the rocking chair near the stove. He sat, not like a guest anymore, but like a man who had once owned empires and now owned only this moment. The girl came over, handed him a drawing of a house, a man, and two small stick figures holding hands with a woman in an apron. He looked at it a long while before folding it carefully and slipping it into his coat pocket. Later that night, as the wind hissed and the snow returned, she found him in the barn, staring at the stars through the half-collapsed roof. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He didn't turn, just said, "It's quiet out here." She stood beside him, not close, but not far either. "It's the kind of quiet that remembers everything," she replied, and for a moment the barn wasn't broken. It was sanctuary. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. Two people who had been shaped by silence had finally found someone who didn't need to fill it. The storm didn't come with thunder this time. It came with tire tracks, deep and deliberate, cutting through the thawing snow like scars on skin. The girl was the first to see them outside the cabin, trailing from the woods to the front gate, then vanishing back into the dark. The widow stood on the porch, arms folded, eyes narrowed not in fear, but recognition. The rancher joined her, slower now, favoring the leg he rarely spoke of. He didn't ask who it was. He already knew. By midday, the town sheriff's truck rolled up, flanked by a car too clean for these parts, its doors bearing the crest of legal authority from the county courthouse. Behind it, a third vehicle idled, windows tinted, engine humming like something that didn't belong to the wind. The preacher stepped out first. His face pinched tight, words already rehearsed. "Mr. Callahan," he said, nodding at the rancher without looking him in the eye, "there are matters of concern, legal and otherwise." From the second car, a man in a suit emerged. Slick hair, thin smile. He unfolded a paper with the slow confidence of someone used to owning the floor, and people on it. "You were presumed dead, Mr. Callahan. Your estate has moved forward with certain transitions. The trust, the land, the accounts, all set to be redistributed under Clause 4C of your will." The widow said nothing. The rancher didn't move. The lawyer continued, his voice cutting through the cold. "But your reappearance complicates things, especially your choice of residence." Now the sheriff spoke. "Town's talking, Cal. They're saying you've been manipulated, taken advantage of in a vulnerable state. That maybe this family kept you from the hospital, from your people." The children stood just inside the door, listening. The rancher looked at them, then at the woman who had washed his blood out of flannel, split wood beside him, said little and gave much. "I've got nothing they didn't already take," he said finally, voice like gravel under frost. The preacher stepped forward. "Then let the town help. Come back. Let us handle things the right way." He turned slowly, facing them all. "I remember the right way," he said. "It was the way that left me bleeding in the snow while my people cashed my name." He stepped off the porch. Not fast, but every step carved a line in the dirt like a quiet stand. The lawyer stepped back. The preacher frowned. The sheriff shifted, unsure. Then the rancher looked directly at the lawyer. "I'll sign whatever paper you want. But if you think I was manipulated, you've clearly never been saved by someone who expects nothing in return." He turned back to the cabin. The girl smiled, not out of joy, but out of knowing she had seen something most adults never learn to say. Truth doesn't shout. It just stands. That night the wind died. The snow, which had threatened to fall all day, hovered in the air like breath held too long. The sky glowed pale, not dark, not light, a stillness before something ended or began. Inside the cabin, the rancher sat at the table with a stack of papers. Legal notices, ownership claims, bank letters, all delivered by the men in suits who had returned just before sunset. They brought polite threats wrapped in obligation, smiled as they handed him the list of everything that would soon no longer be his. The widow said nothing as he read. She washed the dishes, her back turned, knowing this was a battle she couldn't fight for him. Finally he spoke. "I could leave tonight," he said. "Let them take the house. Take the valley. Go back to town, pretend I never saw what a real home looked like." The boy, sitting on the floor beside the fire, looked up. "But you wouldn't, right?" The rancher didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up again, not loud but persistent, like it was trying to remind him of something. He stood and walked to the porch, papers still in his hand. The mule man stood under the tree line again, silent as ever, watching, just as he had once before. "You knew what they'd come for," the rancher said. The mule man nodded once. "And you didn't warn me?" Another slow nod. Then the man spoke, low and sure. "You already knew. Just needed to decide what mattered more, what's on paper or what's been earned." The rancher looked down at the documents in his hand, then back at the cabin, the dull flicker of firelight, the sound of the girl laughing softly as her mother told her to hush. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a pen and signed, but not where they wanted. He wrote a new letter, in his own hand. On the back of their legal sheets, he named no heirs, no bank accounts, no estates, just the land. The cabin, the trees, the creek, the quiet, all to be held by the widow and her children, not as a gift, as repayment, for dignity, for mercy, for reminding a dying man he was still alive. At dawn, the snow finally came, but it didn't fall in violence. It fell soft, like forgiveness, like memory being gently covered by something new. By the time the sun broke the horizon, warm and gold against the white, the lawyers' cars were gone and the land was still. Spring arrived quietly that year, not with blooming flowers or birdsong, but with dry soil, thawed ground, and the soft creak of wood being repaired by hands that had learned patience. The cabin had changed. It still leaned a little in the wind, still groaned in the cold, but it stood straighter now, as if it had decided to stay. The widow planted potatoes in the back field. The boy helped, his cough now just a memory. The girl read out loud by the porch, her voice steady, her feet swinging just above the steps, and the rancher. He no longer limped as much. He moved like a man who had been broken and stitched back together, not perfectly, but with care. He wore an old coat, no name stitched on the inside. His money meant little now, but his hands were calloused from chopping wood. Not signing checks, he never returned to town. The preacher stopped coming, even the sheriff grew quiet. People remembered, some with shame, some with silence, but no one questioned his choice again. On Sundays, they sat outside with mugs of bitter coffee and watched the wind comb through the trees. Sometimes the mule man stopped by, left something on the porch, a bundle of herbs, a sharpened knife, a tin of salt, and left before anyone could say thank you. The rancher never asked for more. He only stayed, present, human, real. He built the girl a bookshelf from scraps, repaired the roof, carved the boy a wooden horse that didn't rock, but stood firm. They never spoke of the storm. They never needed to. And when the sun rose too early one morning and lit the frost in gold, the girl looked up and whispered, "Do you think everything broken can be fixed?" The rancher didn't answer. He just placed another log on the fire, steady, silent, warm. And the snow kept falling, quiet as forgiveness.